Welcome to SEPSA Talk. I am Evans Apia Kisi, the host of SEPSA Talk. SEPSA is Center for Better Society Advocacy and Research Africa. SEPSA Africa is a non-profit organization that believes in a better society for all. We in SEPSA Africa believe that a better society begins with you and I. Hashtag, a better society begins with me. For more information, please log on to www.sepsaafrica.org. Please follow us on the various social media platforms: YouTube, SEPSA Talk, Facebook at SEPSA Africa, Instagram, SEPSA Africa, and Twitter at SEPSA Africa. Like always, today, we bring you another interesting discussion on the topic, how do we solve Africa's coup conundrum? The African region has seen more than 200 successful and failed coups since the 1960s. In the last decade, there have been a number of successful coups in Africa, in particular the West African region. For example, talk about the 2010 coup in Niger, the 2013 coup in Central African Republic and Egypt, the 2015 coup in Burkina Faso, the 2017 coup in Zimbabwe, the 2012, 2020, and 2021 coups in Mali, and recently the 2021 coup in Guinea. Surprisingly to the international community, recent and past coups have been met with jubilation amongst many citizens in the affected countries. Just last week, there has been reports of a call for a coup in Sudan by dozens of protesters. And so what we do in this episode of SEPSA Talk is to look at why coups are so common in some parts of Africa and whether coups can ever be justified and what governments can do to stop coup. And to help us deal with such an important topic are Mr. Collins Izuchukwu Igboji. He is currently a doctoral researcher at the Chair of Public Law with a focus on environmental and planning law at the Brandenburg University of Technology, Cottbus, Schenftenberg, Germany. His interest lies in institutional analysis, sustainable food systems, and Pan-Africanism. I must say that it's a pleasure to host you for the first time, Collins. Welcome to SEPSA Talk.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Apia. My pleasure too.
Great. And then our next guest is our own, one of our regular panelists, Akosua Jima. She's also currently a PhD researcher in law. She holds postgraduate researcher. She's a PhD researcher in law and postgraduate researcher at the Lancaster University Law School. And she also holds LLM in diplomacy and international law from the same Lancaster University in England, the United Kingdom. Her expertise lies in international human rights law, international refugee law, international policy and law, and European policy and law. Welcome back to SEPSA Talk again, Akosua.
I'm very happy to be back. Always nice to see your nice smile, and thanks for the invite. Nice to meet with you, Mr. Collins, as well.
Nice to meet you too, Akosua.
Great. And let me just, first of all, apologize to our viewers and our listeners who have been waiting for the past 40 minutes. We had some tech issues and we do apologize for that. But the good news is that we are here and we can have our show in the next 60 minutes. I also have to remind you that we are streaming live on Facebook. And so those of you who are joining us live on Facebook, please do send in your questions and comments. We also have some audience here on Zoom, and we would like to remind you to send any questions or comments in the chat session. So Collins and Akosua, welcome once again to SEPSA Talk.
Thank you, Dr. Apia.
Thank you. It's good to see you again.
Sure, good to see you too. So I would like to start with you, Akosia, first. And as we read from the synopsis, we would want to start with why are coups so common in some parts of Africa, particularly West Africa. And we would want to learn more. What are the underlying causes for most coups across Africa in general?
I am trying to. Am I on?
Sure, you're on and the voice is clear. So
okay, sorry, I wasn't sure. I'm always panicky about technology, but thank you, and thank you for the audience for joining us, as well as those on Facebook and Zoom. Thank you, fellow panelists. That's a good question. I think, in general, coups have been very common with African countries way back after independence. And it sounds to me, most of the recurrent reasons seems to be corruption and mismanagement and poverty. I also would like, and many times it sounds to me that is the justification many of these coupists or people that perpetrate these kinds of acts often cite. I personally think part of it is because during independence, I kind of feel as if the people that actually rallied people towards independence, I always feel they probably wanted the independence, but I also don't think they took the time to actually learn what it takes to build governance, those kinds of the skills and the tools and the structures to hold a government. I think they probably didn't have time to do it. So the excitement around we want the colonialists to go, and I think there is a certain level of, I would say, naivety whereby they wanted the independence, and sometimes when you're sitting aside, you don't quite realize what goes into governing. And I think that's part of the problem. In the case of Africa, I also would like to say, part of the reason is because of the colonial structures that were in place, because keep in mind, the colonial structures had actually divided Africa way back in 1885 during the Berlin dividing of Africa, the so-called scramble for Africa. And I kind of feel as if they divided Africa without actually recognizing the ethnic spread. So then when they divided, it sounds to me, different ethnic groups were lumped under different territories, right? So you would take Ghana, for example, the lines or the so-called boundaries that were done between Ghana and La Côte d'Ivoire, you could see that some of the Akans are still in La Côte d'Ivoire. You could also see some of the Evers are in Togo. And when you go to the north, you could see some of the Burkina, maybe ethnic groups, I'm not so sure which one. Part of them could be in Ghana and they could be a minority and they could be a majority. And then when you go to the other side of the border, you could see that other families spread that way. And so one of the things I would say, even though people would like to just technically build it on corruption and mismanagement and yada, 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 I would like to say part of it is the lack of preparation in terms of institutions, right? Because they wanted independence, but I don't think they had enough time to actually build skills and the tools that is required to be able to govern. I also do, as I said, because of these boundaries, African countries are sort of fractured states. We have all these micro-states, and micro-state in terms of small states in Africa. And these small states, I believe in Niger also, there is about, how many ethnic groups? Like an African country could have like 20 ethnic groups lumped within the same territory. Or it could be some places actually have 200 groups lumped in the same territory. And many of these prior to independence, or prior to colonial, the colonial project, prior to the Europeans' arrival, many of these technically probably even didn't get along. So in summary, your question is, why are coups common? I think part of it is the colonial structures. Part of it is so many ethnic groups lumped in the same area and lack of enough preparation and structures. The other part of it is after independence, I also think because of these these things that I already explained, after independence, there was a lot of fight for power, okay? And then, as you know, there's a lot of ethnic politics in Africa whereby people rally or political parties are sort of formed or shaped by or along ethnic lines. So you could see that certain particular groups actually tend to align to certain particular ethnic groups, and the parties are as such. So you could see that depending upon the leaders of the party, typically people of the same ethnic group tend to coalesce around specific political groups and largely based on ethnic groups. And so some of these problems actually began to surface after independence. Part of it too is the reality setting in, because again, many of them thought there is money, or once the white man is gone, we're gonna govern and everything was gonna be all right. So besides the governance structures, I think reality also set in very, very quickly. And all of these, the economics, the culture, the ethnic divisions, and the scramble for power, competition for power, all started to sort of surface. That's my take of it. And so you could see that when the colonialist was also in power, certain particular ethnic groups were educated. Certain groups were actually given power disproportionately. So then after the colonialists, and a lot of times in Africa, one of the things that happened in many African countries, and it's quite common, typically the colonialists actually educated the minority groups, right? So they would, if you go to Rwanda, for example, the Tutsis were privileged. If you go to Nigeria, you could see that the northern Nigerians were actually favored in terms of power, concentration of power. So and when you go to different African countries, it's almost like that. In Ghana, for example, the Fantis, you could see that even where the schools were established. The good schools, the very good schools that are in Ghana are around the coastal areas, either in Accra or Cape Coast, around those areas. So those particular groups were favored. And so those groups were also given power in terms of who was recruited in the colonial police force. So many of these, after the colonialists left, it sounds to me also generated these animosity between those that were favored. And so there was that struggle for power. And I kind of feel, even though people talk about here and now, I feel all of these have culminated into the fractures we see. So then right after independence, on top of the hopes that Africans had, many of them were hoping once the white man was gone, we're gonna be fine. Of course, reality setting, we weren't fine. And so then people began to demand change. And so then the military began to also intervene in many of these cases, whereby they feel they would intervene. They sort of capitalized on the people's resentment and disappointment and intervened. And again, when they came in, the monies had dried up. And so then the others also recognized that, they're also corrupt. But one thing is, once a coup happens in one country, then there's that domino effect in terms of multiple coups. So then once somebody shows the way, well, there's one coup, so the countries that have more coups tend to have more coups, because then somebody has already shown the way. So the other person also come in to capitalize on the resentment, because once somebody comes in, then they can't deliver anymore. And then the other person also capitalize on it and make it seem as if it's entirely by corruption. So yes, corruption and mismanagement and the reality of poverty could have played a role. However, I feel these underlying factors are often totally ignored, but they play a big role in terms of what is happening right now. So I would kind of leave it and see whether probably Mr. Nanayo may have something, or Collins may have something to say.
Sure. Thank you very much, Akosia. It's quite interesting that you take us back into history, pointing out that things like ethnic diversity had a major role to play on the onset of Coup. This is also a position that Lord actually asked on Facebook, the role that ethnic diversity plays in Coup. You also talked about the colonial structures. That's quite true in those days, but I'll just ask a follow-up question, whether you think in this modern era, that would be a reason for the coup, because the colonial masters left some 60, 50 years ago, depending on the country that we are talking about in Africa. And some countries perhaps were not even colonized at all. And some countries that were colonized themselves also have never experienced coup before. So do you still feel that that is still a reason for coup in the current situation? As we read in the synopsis, in the last decade, we've seen a number of coups. I don't think we could blame this on the colonial structures, right?
I disagree, because you cannot eliminate it from it. Even when you look at who occupies power right now, it is the same thing that has happened right after independence, right? So you could see that who even runs African countries these days, it is around the same political elites. It hasn't changed very much. So it's the same structures going on. So I don't think you can totally eliminate it. Number two, since independence, as I do believe in the summary that you sent, you rightfully said, between 1956 and actually, political scientists and different studies have put it between 1956 and 2001, there's been about at least 200 coups also. And many of these started right after independence. If you look at Ghana from 1966 and on, if you look at, I believe, Chad, it started from 1965. If you look at, so the stability started from then. The coups happened, the majority of them, from independence till, I believe, 2001, I believe. Many of the coups were happening on the average of 4 a year. And so many of the majority of the coups happened during that time. It was between that time and 2019 that the average was like 2 per year. So then it's only stabilized in the last 20 years. And we could see from 2019 and on, it started to resurface. So yes, it may not have a direct connection, but it does have it, because there is still a concentration of power within a specific group that hasn't changed very much. Because when you look, everybody looks in their country where the powers are concentrated around the colonial times, it's the same. There may have been a few deviations, but predominantly it is the same family. If you look at Ghana, for example, if you look at who is running, whether you look at Nana Akufo-Addo's family, you look at Mr. Mohammed's family, you track back, and their fathers were either ministers, prime ministers, what have you. If you look at not just the leaders themselves, but the other leaders, whether they're the political elite or the political class, each one of them, go back to maybe Mr. Baumia, go back to all the other political parties, the leading figures in all the political parties, look at it and trace it down. They're all linked to those structures. So, and then you said there are certain countries that have not experienced coups.
Yeah, like Botswana, Tanzania, Cape Verde.
Well, Botswana had a different take, and those are exceptions rather than the norm. The majority of African countries have experienced coups. At some point in time, there were 35 wars, I believe up to the 1990s in Africa. Africa has the most coup continent in the whole world. So it has many of these, and you cannot eliminate those. So we speak colonial language. And then again, when you look, you break it down and go to all of these countries. You look at Chad, for example, from independence, from the person who had the power, and eventually 1990, as to the intervention of France, to have the person who just recently, the person who, through France intervening in 1990, put Mr., what's his name? The one who was defeated, Derby, who had actually stayed in power from then, from up till, what's that called? 2013, April of this year, who was actually eliminated, has been in power for many, many years and was supported by France. And if you look at different countries, it might not be direct. Besides indirect control, influence, the structures themselves as to who is educated in Ghana, who speaks the most English, who, those people that fought the colonialists were actually sidelined, where the people their colonialists actually rallied around the people, the marginalized group in their community, and actually put power. And those kinds of animosity has stayed till now. And the political parties now, as I said, it's identity politics. And you cannot eliminate how people actually join a certain political groups. For the majority of times, it's because it's partly their, and you know how the chiefs play a role as well. So they rally around their own people. And you cannot eliminate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akosua. So I'll bring in Collins now. Collins, what's your take also why are coups so common in some parts of Africa? I don't know whether you agree with Akosua and whether you feel there are other underlying causes. I mean, she brings in very interesting perspectives with the role of colonial powers and ethnic diversity, of course. She also mentions issues of poverty, corruption, and the likes. What's your take on why coups are so common in Africa?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Appiah. I mean, from the narrative Akosua gave us just now, we just saw that the topic we have at hand is so complex. I mean, you cannot just simplify coups or coup d'etat in a country, in a continent like Africa, or even like in West Africa. So I love the way she gave the historical undertone behind this coup, because like the writer Chimamanda Adichie always say, you cannot tell a people's story and start with secondly. I mean, you have to start from where it all started. So I love her historical narrative about the coup, and I just have to buttress in some of the things he said, because he mentioned something like elite capture and the excitement to grab power. I mean, yeah, just like Frantz Fanon said in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, he said that, yeah, during the independence wave that, that flung around Africa in the 60s, most of our leaders or the people that fought for independence were mainly excited. They are just interested in grabbing the power without investing much in how to build the new nations. So you see countries like Nigeria experiencing coup just 6 years, coup d'etat, just 6 years after the independence. But I want to point out that coup in Africa, and I wouldn't just limit it to West Africa, because coup in Africa, it just can be divided into two eras. That's the area I want to go. We have the era of the 60s, which were mainly influenced by what I would call external factors. Then was in the middle of the Cold War. So a lot was going on, and there was a proxy war, which also took place in Africa. Those proxy war was between, the East and the West. And it also influenced a lot of coup d'etat in Africa. Let's take, for example, what happened with Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba was ousted because they believed he has some allegiance with the East, having approached USSR, the now Russia, for some assistance. And when he got the plan of the military trying to overthrow him, he contacted Belgium. But Belgium and the US then were so skeptical to help him, because they believe, oh, this man has some communist tendencies. So in that direction, they kept quiet till Mobutu Sese Seko overthrew him. We also have some instance in Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah was also accused of, like, the body language of everything was being a communist. So a lot of coups, coup d'etat then was influenced by the Cold War going on at that time. So then I would say, yeah, the Western influence or the influence of the colonialists was very, very, very impactful to the first generation of the coup. However, when you talk about coup d'etat, we are removing something, which is, what is coup all about? It's illegal and overt attempt or successful attempt, to take over a government. And now, what is government all about? What is governance? Governance simply means the people. Yeah, so governance simply means the people. So talking about the people now, will now bring me now forward to the recent happenings happening. Now, from the recent happenings we are experiencing, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, please go ahead. We had a bit of
happenings,
problem, but it's fine now.
Yeah, Yeah, from the recent happenings, because I experienced a glitch in my internet connection. So from the recent happenings we are experiencing, I would say that the current events playing out in West Africa and other parts of Africa is simply, the failure of democracy. Democracy has failed. And before we look at saying that military takeover, it starts from the regime. Like, let's give example from what is happening in Africa. You see some leaders trying to apply what I will simply call third termism. When your tenure is over, you try to extend it. You try to find a way to unconstitutionally stay or remain in power. So these things over time, you plunge your country into crisis. And over time, people have to step in, to address the situation. And most times, the reason for the coup in recent times is, we want to protect democracy, we want to protect the Constitution. So while we look at the historical narrative and everything surrounding ethnicism and whatever, we also have to look at the reasons why the recent events are happening. So it's simply because democracy have failed, and we have the elements that makes a country democratic, which we are not seeing in Africa today. Democracy have to be competitive in the sense that everybody should be involved, to compete favorably in a democratic setting, which we are not seeing in many African countries today. It also has to be inclusive, political inclusive, where groups, there shouldn't be anything like social exclusion. But today, this is what we are seeing in many African countries. And the third one, we have to see a level of sufficient level of political and civil liberty. In that sense, how are we faring today in our different countries? Things like, how are civil societies faring? Are they permitted to express themselves? Are we having a free press? You understand? So when all these things come into play, you can establish a nexus between this failure of democracy, which have now made people to lose faith in it. Because when you cannot eliminate corruption, poverty, and everything sold, to make democracy all good, now military takeover becomes inevitable. So I would say that this is the main causes of the second phase of the coup we are currently experiencing in West Africa.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Colin. So pretty much similar to what Akosua said, except that you divide the phases of coup into two, the first era and then the second era. And you say that the first era was mainly externally driven by the colonial powers and the colonial structures that I guess Akosua talked about. And you bring in a very interesting point, which is the current era, which you feel is more about the failure of democracy, or what you described and has been described by others about an attempt to go for the third term or third termism, as you attempted to qualify. That's very interesting. Yeah. But what about things? I've also heard things that of recent times, it has also been about the interest of the military. I mean, of course, for third termism, I probably would say it's more of the interest of the people. But there are instances where we've heard the recent coup about the 2015 one in Burkina Faso. We've heard that it was also about the interest of the military. What's your take on that? Don't you think the interest of the military also has been a part of the recent coup?
Yeah, thank you very much. And like I said, the issue at hand is very complex. And Africa is also a complex continent that we cannot just, simplify these events. Yeah, we have some countries where the interest of the military has also led to coup and the coup d'etat. And the perfect example is the example you just gave, Burkina Faso. Over years, Blaise Compaoré, who ousted Thomas Sankara, he used the military, which we are also seeing in other African countries today, to perpetuate himself in power and commit all sorts of atrocity and gross human rights abuses. So in those cases, you get the military actively involved in politics. So sometimes you cannot really stop what you've just started. When the military are actively involved in politics, you get them. And recently, even the war on terrorism have actually made the military to be involved, because now the military receive more funds. They are empowered. You cannot even separate them from politicians again, especially at the hierarchy, the topmost hierarchy of the military. So all those things at a point when a government comes in, or when these economic problems being experienced in these countries, because yeah, as you mismanage the country economy, it affects every sector. So when these economic problems start playing out, and you now want to defund the military or limit their interest, it can also lead to coup d'etat, like we see in Burkina Faso. So because we really believe that at some point we have to defend our interests, no matter whose ours is God. So in those
thank you very much, Collins. And I have to say that you already even started giving recommendations as to how to address some of these, because that's exactly what we'll come to at the very final part of this discussion. So of course, if I listen to Collins, and he divides this courses into two, and the very last one that he touched on, which is the current one, of these failure of democracy, then the question people ask, which is also a recent debate, is whether some coups can be justified. Can we ever justify any coup at all? Or like people say, do we have good coups and bad coups? And so what makes a coup a good one, and what makes a coup d'etat a bad one? Can we ever justify a coup, Akosia?
Again, thanks again. And I do agree with Mr. Collins or to a greater extent, because I think in terms of the immediate, those people, many African leaders, I think, have extended their term, and in most cases that has been a trigger. Rwanda, for example, the leader extended it for a long period of time. Burundi, I think, did, and recently we've seen in Guinea, as well as even if you look at Niger and Chad, some of these leaders actually came to power through military means, and then they sort of stay on. When you look at Guinea, for example, the leader, I was quite surprised to know this Mr. Conde was actually a human rights professor who was the only democratically elected leader. So prior to that, after independence, the country had never really experienced a transfer of power. And it's so ironic that after the other leader died and they had to give him the chance to do, he had to extend it. You go to La Côte d'Ivoire, look at I forgot the guy's name. He's now back in there. And so it goes on, and I think Central African Republic, and you go to Benin, the guy's there as if like a god. If you go to Sudan, the al-Bashir who was taken out, he came into power in 1989 or so, through coup d'etat. And then he installed himself and again stayed on until he was ousted. You look at Mugabe, who actually was seen at first as a revolutionary leader, and then he came into power. And again, he made himself king. Even Kwame Nkrumah, that you guys praise all the time, or many Guineans praise, he again, he wanted to make himself president for life. And that was that's part of the narrative many people don't want to talk about, because he wanted to stay on and stay on. And that often you could see that even at that time, the interest of extending your time could actually be a trigger. Because again, as Mr. Collins has said, it doesn't give the rest of the people the chance to be able to elect or have the chance to have a say. And that is where the democracy thing is not working. A study by I think Afrobarometer recently, I believe 2019, 2020, measured the African people's opinion about 19 African countries. And they found that about 42% of Africans, only 42% of Africans believe in democracy in terms of believing in it to actually change power for them. Like essentially, they don't quite believe that voting in an election actually affect the change they want. They feel the elections are gamed. And so because of that, election is unable, or democracy is unable to change non-performing leaders, right? And about another 40% or so also felt MPs don't represent their views. So that speaks to what Mr. Collins was saying about the fact that it is the faith in the people that is democracy delivering us the change we want. Again, inclusive participation. And that is where you cannot also eliminate their colonial structures, because it's the same, again, same people. The powers are shared between the same political elite. Even the coups that they do, the military class also belong to the same families, so it doesn't transfer. So back to your question around, is there a good coup? I think oftentimes a lot of people think that when the leader begins to actually undermine the Constitution, that in itself, many people feel that in itself is a coup in itself, because it is almost like subverting the Constitution. Because if you're a leader and the Constitution, we all agreed, because again, it's a contract between you and the citizens. The terms are supposed to be, your term is 2 terms. At the end of it, you have to leave and allow somebody to come in. But then the idea that after that, you can maneuver and change and establish yourself. I kind of feel as if you tell the people that you are above the law, and you can actually, it's actually dangerous in itself, I think. So I think the very fact that you're subverting the Constitution that you and the people are supposed to abide by, you didn't respect it. So I kind of feel as if you open a door for others, because if you didn't, it's almost like you're a leader in a family or a leader of an institution. The moment you begin to actually subvert the rules, or you begin to misbehave, you actually, you open a floodgate for people to also do something bad. So yes, in those particular cases, people feel that when the leader is unable to deliver, when the leader is not allowing people to participate, when the leader is actually maybe executing extrajudicial killings, suppressing civil society, suppressing the opposition, and not allowing different voices to actually come in. If you look at Rwanda, for example, even many African countries think that he is bringing so-called development, therefore he's justified to stay. And some people actually call it, is that benevolent, autocratic leader? But then what if he dies tomorrow? What institutions did he build, right? Did he sort of build the country around himself? And then he could either have built it around himself, or he built it around the people he rallied around himself. So he didn't create structures in the society to let it sustain. So that means the moment he leaves office, everything is going to fall apart. And we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it in Egypt, we've seen it in Zimbabwe, because the leader can be there. You can call them a hero, you can call them effective leader. You can, Mr. Rawlings was there for 20 years, because it has to, if it's democracy, you need to allow the institutions to work. Institutions meaning the Constitution, the laws, the parliament, civil society, the judiciary, their election commission, however they call it in different countries. They need democracy. There are certain elements that have to work together with democracy. And those are the institutions I already mentioned. And if you don't, those institutions are supposed to be accountable. They're supposed to be autonomous. They're supposed to be acting independently. And if you don't allow them to function the way they function, because they have to function in addition to you, the executive, in order for the democracy to continue to flourish and establish and develop and advance and become entrenched in the society. So when the people believe that they have the opportunity, if you don't even perform, they have the opportunity to vote for somebody else to get rid of you, maybe it wouldn't justify, or they might be upset with the military subverting the Constitution. But if you begin to sort of establish yourself, suppress voices, start to jail people, then the people sometimes don't see these leaders, autocratic leaders, people don't see there's other avenues. The democratic institutions are not avenues to effect the change they want, in case they're dissatisfied with you, because you may be even bringing development, but you may be killing people. You may be doing development at the expense of free choice, at the expense of free voices, at the expense of respecting human rights. And so then when the people don't want you, you may be bringing them heaven, but they don't want you. But then if you begin to sort of shut down all avenues of changing you by extending the constitution in the case of Rwanda to 2034, then what happens with all the people you arrested? What voice do they have? And then when you begin to subvert the courts, that they can't speak up to bring justice for the people you arrested, what are they going to do? So yes, in those particular cases, people think it may be justified. The sad news, though, is a lot of times the military, their research that people have done is in many cases, the military only acts when their monies are reduced, when the economy is not going well, and then their budget for the military is cut. Then they sort of capitalize on the people's resentments and come in. In many of these cases, the military is unable to deliver because the coffers are dry, and there's no guarantees the military is also not going to be corrupt because, again, they're part of the same elite. If you look at Guinea, the guy who is there was chosen by Condé and the same ethnic group by Condé. So he may present himself as a hero, but he's still from the same establishment. How did he get there? He got there by handpicked by this particular person. So he's still part of the elite. The people that he may rally around may, because it's also not by democratic means, it's not open to scrutiny. So then how do they ensure that the people he's also chosen are actually people that may be accountable? So in many of these cases, I don't think the people actually get the change they want. In many cases, research also shows that these coups in Africa have not actually brought the social change and the economic transformation that the people are looking for. So I don't know the answer to whether that's a good coup. In terms of instant change to make the people happy, instant gratification, perhaps yes. But as to whether it actually translates into economic changes, human right, respect for human right, inclusion, social change, I don't know. Economic change, I don't know whether they actually brought those changes to the people's lives.
It was, thank you very much, Akosua, for the very extensive answer that you gave to a simple but very complex question. I have to agree here. But two follow-up questions. I know you might drag this a bit, and I want you to be a bit brief for us. I know you were careful not to answer in the affirmative, whether yes or no, whether we have a good coup or a bad coup. You've given very brilliant answers here, and it's for our viewers to judge for themselves. But my two follow-up questions. One is that because you stressed more on the case of Rwanda, I get a sense that as you speak, do you have a feeling that they might experience coup one day when they get fed up with Paul Kagame? Because it feels like there's two competing scenarios here. So you call it that the constitution has been subverted. I probably would not say that. Even in the case of Guinea, I feel, yes, a referendum was organized. One could always question that, whether it was fair, free or not, but at least the referendum was organized. He could go for another term. It appears the coup happened because the people were not happy with his performance. Similar situation in Rwanda. People still keep Kagame because they feel they are happy with his performance. So do you feel there might be a coup one day when they get fed up with him?
If there's no alternative, the people that speak up are jailed. What do you and referendum? Well, Mr. Condé also organized some sort of referendum to be able to change it, all right? So many of these, it's maneuvering around that. In the case of Rwanda, first of all, the Belgians and the Germans always favored Kagame's group because they're lighter skinned. They're only 14%. The Tutsis in Rwanda are 14% of the population. The Hutus are 85%. And then these people had always ruled Rwanda. And so the only chance of Hutus being in power, the only leader was the one that was assassinated, engineered by Mr. Kagame and his rebel group. Okay, operating from Burundi, which also has Tutsis and Hutus. Okay, the plane was short. The Hutu leader was actually killed in the process. And that actually triggered the genocide. And people, again, only talk about the surface. They don't talk about why the genocide happened in the first place. They only talk about, oh, 800,000 people were dead. Why did that happen? It is the disenfranchisement of the majority, and it is still happening. Do you know how many Hutus are refugees in Democratic Republic of Congo? Do you know that Mr. Kagame has stationed army in DRC to prevent these Hutus from coming over to Rwanda? So at what expense? You're saying they're happy. Oh, well, how much of the news that come out of Rwanda is uncensored? Rwanda only allowed what Kagame wants to be broadcasted. So again, you want me to keep it brief. It is subjective. He changed the constitution. There is no election. His only time of having the next election was when the constitution was changed. So I am not predicting any coup, but I wouldn't be surprised if the moment, but maybe that's why he's extending it, to be able to consolidate a power still around the 14% Tutsis, and some, maybe he's bringing in some Hutus, but in general, I feel it is a dangerous precedent. Wherever a minority group continues to suppress a majority, or a particular group begins to stay in power for however long, it is still going to implode, no matter how long it stays. So I'm not so sure how democratic this Rwanda thing is.